Okay, they normally say it's a graveyard session after lunch. So I don't know why they call it a graveyard, but I guess it's up to the panelists to actually make sure that you pay attention, as this is actually the most important part of this session. My name is Susan Mangole from the Department of Trade Industry and Competition. The branch is incentive branch dealing with industrial financing. So we are here today. We heard from various speakers why we are here, and I think we got several sort of pointers. Thanks to the research by the JSE, thanks to Dr. Ndidi and some of the participants, we now can see where we are and how to. Now the question, the bigger one, is that what is the impact in terms of the upstream and downstream? Are we going to be early adopters? What will be the impact to the economy? What is the impact if we are not customizing it to South Africa? Because there were various views to say that whereas that internationally they are moving, as South Africa, we need to look at the local context. So I'm going to just, in no particular order, I'm going to start with MTN, because earlier on, we were told that MTN in Nigeria was the first one to raise their hand. Asanda, over to you.
Testing, 1, 2. Thank you so much. I suppose when answering the question around the upstream and downstream considerations, as big business, you ask yourself with the first question around what role would you play? And I think there is an acknowledgement and a recognition that you play a role in, one, influencing the implementation and the adoption across the value chain. You can also play a very key and critical role beyond influence in the driving the implementation through, one, your procurement, etc. And maybe before I sort of tackle the considerations themselves, I suppose for us, or particularly for us as a business, there is a very big recognition, I think, from a board level around we can only manage what we are measuring, and we can only improve on what we have measured. And so measurement is very important. And I think core to our strategy, one of our strategic pillars is creating shared value. And so ANSI, I think, aligned to a lot of the conversations that we had earlier around what's the role of business, what's the role of making sure that you are realizing both business growth alongside social progress. It's exactly there. So we see it particularly on two lenses. There is the one lens around how do you make sure that you are managing your most material impacts, which is critical, which is important, is our compliance leg. There is also the lens around how do you actually manage the value creation pillar of sustainability. And as opposed to perhaps even, I suppose, core or underscoring this lens, we undertook a journey, for example, where we measured the value creation pillar, and recently you'll see a lot of work around what value are we creating, both from a social and also ecological impact perspective, and what value are we what value are we eroding, and being clear and reporting on both those impacts. I think that's the journey that we've undertook recently. I think, coming back to our conversation right now on the upstream, one needs to be very clear around what are the different sectors' materiality points, I think, as a consideration. And I think thankfully to Dr. Ndidi's comments earlier on, the use of the likes of Sustainalytics, where you can have at the very least a bird's eye view of what that is, does really help. But to what degree is that important? It then leads me to my second consideration. It becomes important because, to what I mentioned around what roles you play from an influence and also drive of implementation, you then start to ask, what is your climate resilience strategy, and what are your most material impacts? If I'm looking at either to talk about my top suppliers, if I'm looking at Upstream, is it based on is it my financial contribution there, or is it a blend of who are the most material emitters in the sense of CO2 emission, again, just as an example, whatever that category is. You then start applying that category and say, how do I test to ensure that your climate strategy at a strategy point addresses the material impacts that you're making in the value chain? That's one. You then are enabled to look at those metrics and targets more closely. Again, you're not necessarily going to be a red pen as a big corporate, but at the very least you can be an influence, and you can question where you can. And then obviously, even through the assurance lens, again, trying to drive a standardized understanding baseline, and being, and being confident around, call it your upstream value players, that you are all, realistically and reasonably addressing your material issues. So what are the implications? I think for me, particularly on Upstream, you're looking at those. It's understanding that sector materiality. It's understanding, which then informs your ability to test the climate resilience strategies, for you to be able to test and measure targets and assurance. And this is all can be embedded very simply in a procurement process, as an example. Another big consideration whilst you're talking about that is the cost. Do the cost of goods and services flow through to yourself? Or is the expectation that you have these requirements without the cost benefit becomes another important consideration. So that flow of cost is important. Maybe let me pause there before I give any perspectives on the downstream. I feel like
Okay.
long-winded.
Thank you so much. Some interesting insight. Sun International, I guess obviously the question will be the same, the implication for the upstream and the downstream, especially for your sector.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Raveshni Maraj. I'm the Group ESG Manager at Sun International. I think just in terms of the journey that we as an organization has gone through the last 7 years or so, from when we started off with sustainability at the organization to where we see ourselves now, there's definitely been a transition in terms of seeing how can we create value within the organization, leveraging ESG itself. We started off purely looking at it, from a social, economic development perspective, from an environmental perspective, from a health and safety perspective. And now we're on the path in terms of how do we look at it across the board, across all departments within the organization itself. I think from an upstream perspective, it's through our procurement and our service providers and the suppliers that we engage with. Being in the sector that we are, we have stringent requirements on ourselves through our gambling licenses in terms of local procurement, and how do we encourage that at all our different properties itself. We're widespread in terms of, from a geographic perspective, some are in where we have rural communities surrounding us, and how do we then offer them those opportunities to be suppliers to us. I can give you the example, everybody knows Sun City, we've got a lot of communities around there. How do we bring them into our value chain in terms of the services that they can offer us? How do we capacitate them? How do we give them the necessary technical skills and expertise to enable them to be long-term suppliers for us? So through our procurement processes, we've actually engaged with some of our SME suppliers to ask them, what are some of the challenges that you are facing in terms of understanding from a sustainability ESG perspective, and how can we as an organization, assist you in that journey in terms of how you leverage sustainability and ESG to better enhance your service offering, not just to us as a customer, but to build your customer base as well. So that's a journey that we're doing with some of our suppliers, specifically focusing on Black women-owned suppliers. That is one of our key focus areas in terms of how do we create those opportunities for them. How do we look at suppliers that we have currently in our database? Encourage them to see, is there an opportunity for you to bring in Black women into your businesses itself? So from an upstream perspective, that's what we look at. From for us, it's from an F&B perspective, it's from laundry, it's from waste management, and we've had good examples within the organizations where we've actually managed to make those transitions in terms of giving opportunities to local companies. As an example, again, at Sun City, we have a Black woman-owned company, local, 2 ladies that have taken over the running of our waste management services, and that's one of our largest properties in our group that generates the most amount of waste. So to give them that opportunity, clearly demonstrates our commitment to supporting that. And then from a downstream perspective, for us, it's our customers, it's the experience that we sell to them, and how do we make sure that we offer them the best experience possible. And that comes through how we leverage the data that we collect from our customers through our customer management process in terms of understanding what are their trends, what are their expectations, what are they looking for from a service delivery perspective. Would they prefer more digital check-in and services that way? And how do we maximize that, and how do we address that through the app that we have to make that more easier for them to access the services that they want? So there's various ways in which we're looking at it, but also it comes back to how do we position ourselves as a responsible company, not just in terms of our social responsibility, but as a responsible gambling company as well, in terms of how do we educate our customers in terms of being responsible itself. I think the other key area for us is the social work that we do within our communities itself. That is also a requirement of us in terms of our gambling licenses, in terms of what we put back into our communities through our socioeconomic development programs. And again, there we look at it from an employment perspective, what opportunities we make available to them, but also how do we uplift the communities themselves in terms of the programs and initiatives that we do. And a big focus for us is to actually not just spend the money, but to identify and assess what is the impact and the value of the work that we are doing with them. So I hope I've, in a nutshell, given you some insights into what we're doing at Sun.
Thank you so much. Going to first rent, you have actually touched in quite a lot that in terms of what you're doing. So ourselves and first rent, we're sitting almost in the same sort of group. The question is that what is the impact of sustainability to financiers, the impact also, the cost of that particular adoption, but also you can also share your insight in terms of your upstream and downstream approach to this. Thanks.
Thank you for the opportunity. Yes, I wasn't going to spend so much time on upstream because my colleagues have covered that. And we do pretty much the same. I think we play a large role in terms of capacity building and raising awareness with SMEs, and also providing funding for them to build their businesses and to build capacity to understand what it is that we are asking them. We build awareness through asking certain questions about ESG and whether they comply. The reason for the awareness drive is that to calculate your greenhouse emissions is not mandatory for companies, smaller companies in South Africa. And so we can't insist in them doing that, but we have started creating awareness. And one of the questions would be that we ask, do you calculate, do you think about your greenhouse emissions? And do you have energy efficiencies? What types of efficiencies do you bring into your production process? But what I'd like to focus on a little bit more is our downstream. So our downstream is the clients that we finance and our investments. And we do take into consideration that the whole sustainability journey takes a lot of money, a lot of capacity, and resources, and we very cognizant of the fact that some of our smaller, medium and enterprises don't have the ability or don't have access to those resources. In terms of financed emissions, which is scope 3, which is mentioned this morning, is in our downstream or in our value chain that we have to measure. I think initially, about 10 years ago, when this was first, and I'm very old, I've been in the group for 23 years. About 10 years ago, when there was first mention globally about financial institutions having to account for their clients' emissions, we kicked and screamed like you cannot believe, because we said it's impossible, we cannot possibly influence our clients, we have no control over what they do. To a certain extent, that's still the truth. However, now we have to report on our scope 3 emissions. So a few years ago, when we realized this was inevitable, we kind of joined forces, which we generally do globally, with a group called the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials. And it was a group of banks, and they all were struggling with this dilemma of how do we account for our clients' emissions? And so what? What if we know the answer? How do we influence? How do we control? How do we work with our clients to transition to net zero by 2050? Well, we started out by setting that target for ourselves for financed emissions. So we have to get there somehow, which means we have to be at net zero emissions for all the financing in our loans and advantage in our balance sheet, advances in our balance sheet. So this PCAF methodology is a methodology that you use when you're working with a lot of assumptions and approximations and estimations where you don't have real data and that you have to have a figure or a baseline. I think it's been mentioned today a few times that you cannot manage what you cannot measure. So to start, you have to have a baseline that you can depart from. And then what we've discovered in the process of applying the PCAF methodology was that our larger listed companies are already reporting and they already comply with requirements of the CDP and integrated reporting in King 3, which is great because they publicly disclose their information, and therefore we could get access to real information, often externally assured and verified, and they would have a plan of transition already. So we've used that information to get real data. So now we have a mixed bunch of smaller companies where we use estimations and approximations in our PCAF methodology, and larger companies where we have real data. And we're almost there where we can establish a baseline. And that's very exciting work because from there we will know what it is that we need to do over the long term. So we will be setting sectoral budgets for sectors that are in the high emitting series, which we've identified. There's about 8 of these sectors. And we will be working with the clients on their transition pathway to get to net zero. We're in the process of setting interim targets. And if you're financed by First Rand, at some point, you will be asked the question about, do you measure your carbon emissions? Do you have a plan to transition? Do you have a plan to build in efficiencies in your process? And that is how we're influencing our value chain downstream. And I just wanted to add, the better you get at this, the more is expected of you. So we have other stakeholders, which is our funders, and that's development finance institutions, like the World Bank. And when we say we've got the PCAF methodology, we're measuring this or whatever, or before we finance, we go through an environmental social risk assessment process to decide whether we want to actually be associated with the client in order to mitigate negative impacts on the environment. And then they'll say, okay, this is great, but what about solar products that you're financing where we import the solar product from China and there's talk that they use slaves or human labor or children in the process. That's the supply chain. How do you manage that? And I think that's, or another example is palm oil in the DRC. They use children in their processes. Palm oil in itself is questionable, so how do you manage that supply chain? And we've had to ask ourselves the question, how long is a piece of string? How far do you go? And we're constantly being asked those questions, and I think, so to start out, to protect yourself, be very clear on your scope, where you have influence, where you have operational control, just make sure that you very clearly describe that, and that you select your most material upstream and downstream supply chain or value chain partners, and that you report on those. Obviously, the better we get, the further we'll have to eventually report on that. But I think that is how we're managing it. We have very little control over company in China using children making solar panels. But at least the consciousness is there, and we'll try and find a solution to manage that process and ask more questions. But that is the extent of where we are at the moment. I think this is a very exciting journey. When we started, as I said, we kicked and screamed. We are now far from that point and maturing into a point where we actually have a better insight and a more comprehension and a more comprehensive view of what it is that we are responsible for and where we are using financial flow and financial capital towards a lower carbon economy.
Thank you so much. It's very interesting that First Rent as a funder, they're already like measuring that and encouraging setting targets with the client. So now the question, I think earlier on from SIPSI, is it voluntary or mandatory as we move along, because we can now see that we can't move away from sustainability. It actually will affect us, and we've been doing quite well in terms of reporting. So now the bigger question is, do we take it forward as voluntary or do we make it mandatory? And also maybe I think I'm going to start again with Sun International to say, if now they come back and say we are going to make it voluntary or mandatory, what exactly can work for South Africa? Because from now the team will have to look and take all the inputs to say, how do we move as a country? And what can be the best way to move? If they say voluntary, people, they don't respond, it doesn't encourage. But also mandatory, what are the implications if now they say it's mandatory?
Thank you so much. It's a very interesting question around, do you make it mandatory or do you make it voluntary? I mean, certainly both have its pros and cons. And voluntary perhaps does not also mean that you leave it open-ended. And I think going back to the point around particularly a role of a big business in your procurement, when you start putting it in as a category or as a criteria, you are starting to introduce sustainability being a competitive lever to be able to secure we'll call it procurement contracts, etc. So I think to humor me, I'm not going to give you a very direct answer. Mandatory really would ensure that there is that aggressive drive and aggressive adoption, certainly. Voluntary, I would also not discount it that much, because you can start introducing elements of competitiveness in the process. If you may allow me, perhaps to also just touch on the downstream element on your initial question. Particularly for an MNO, mobile network operator / technology companies, I think earlier on Dr. Ndidi also touched on the role of technology in the implementation, particularly when you're looking at your CO2 emissions. However, one can also sort of start looking at the opportunities that exists. So admittedly, it is very hard. It is very, you've got a very limited influence and limited control, particularly on customers. But you start looking at technology. Do you bundle technology with a digital measure, for example? Do you bundle a 5G solution with a digital measure of carbon emission? It's opportunities that certainly exist there, particularly around driving that implementation. I'll pause there. Thanks.
Okay, sure. That's an interesting one to say whether it's voluntary or mandatory. I think if I've got to look at it from the journey that we've had at Sun in terms of looking at standards and how we've approached them, I think it's whoever is managing the space, like myself as an example, is how do I make the business case for a specific standard, and what value is that going to bring to the organization? For me, I always bring it back to, am I going to be able to generate revenue for the organization, or am I going to be able to save? And for me, when it comes to these standards, it's also about, educating your executives and your boards in terms of how do you leverage these specific standards to your benefit in terms of the information that you're sharing and how you're being as open and transparent as an organization in terms of what you're doing, to then present to your investors that, yes, I am a good investment for you, to invest in. So I mean, the approach we generally take is to look at it, to see what the value is in a specific standard, and how do we then leverage that. So I'm not going to categorically state it should be mandatory, but I mean, as my colleague has mentioned, when you do make something mandatory, you either do it because you're forced to do it or because you want to do it. But then on the flip side, voluntary means that you are setting yourself apart from your peers, whereas you are taking that initiative to actually look at a specific standard and be a leader in that as well. So I suppose it comes down to how you want to be positioning yourself as your organization in your sector or in the country itself, as whether you want to be seen as a leader or as a follower.
Thank you so much. First Rand, I know that you are sitting on the other side. So now you have to satisfy your funders, the developmental financiers. So the question, I'm going to pose it differently to you, still whether mandatory or voluntary, but also to say, will you make it sort of a criteria for your client to get a discounted rate, interest rate, or do you add a sweetener if they now agree to say we are definitely gonna report on sustainability? Also the issue of saying, how do you change behavior? Because obviously you have to comply with your funders, you also need to comply with the standards. So if you can take it.
I think you very, very neatly captured exactly the challenge that we've been facing for a few years now. There's value in both voluntary and mandatory. Voluntary, business has been leading the sustainability journey for a very long time. We've joined forces with other large businesses, and as SA Inc., we've moved a lot of boundaries. So that was great. Sometimes to a disadvantage. If you were going first in your industry, then you may have been at a competitive disadvantage because people just would take their business somewhere else where it was less PT to get through the process. But I think that landscape has changed significantly. I'm personally all for mandatory. I like the idea. I think after all my life's work, it's very satisfying to see that this could be a mandatory reporting standard, because I do think that it's really important to move the needle. We need a huge amount of capital to make a difference. And it's not just about making a profit for the organization, but also adding social value to the organization, which we've heard at the beginning and throughout the whole day. So, I mean, we've been moved because we're a multinational company. We've been moved by investors for quite some time now, as well as through our funders, to take this very seriously. And we're really now in the process of transferring it to our clients. And yes, there's definitely a benefit, as I said earlier, to our clients. There's a pricing benefit if you have a good standing in terms of how you perform with your sustainability reporting. The opposite's also true. If you refuse to transition and to change, you will either not be financed or you will be negatively priced. So there's definitely that incentive, and I think that's exactly what is intended with the instruction to the financial sector to move financial flows and capital to a low carbon economy. I think it's the only way that it could work.
Thank you so much. So now you know if you're looking for investment with First Rand, if you're not complying with sustainability, you're going to be negatively affected. So that's the reason why you're paying more, a higher interest. I think it's very interesting because obviously where we are sitting now is that we also trying to accommodate everybody to say where to from here. We want to either see whether we can be the early adopters. We also want to check the implication. Earlier on, the JSE, Tanya, did touch on the cost and the cost implication. But also, one of the things that we need to also look at is the cost to the economy, to say how much will it cost us if we're not complying, and what benefits are we going to get if we are now complying with the sustainability standards. So I'm going to now go around in terms of your parting sort of statement to the policymakers, to the working group, especially coming from your perspective to say how they should actually approach this. It will take us some time to be able to get where we are, but we have to move. The truth is that we have to move. What advice can you then provide to the team that will be complying and that will be writing the documents? What is it that you want to see inside the documents that will actually localize and put everything into South African perspective?
Thank you. I think a very key consideration, you touched on it, is one, the cost of not reporting, the cost of not proactively managing, the cost of going back, of doubling down, really, economically and also to the environment. And I mean, one needs to not belabor the point, but we can see, for example, the climate-related impacts in our continent. And I think just one, reflecting on that cost of not doing it is important. I think two, it's then also looking at the benefits, the value creation, once you start managing accurately, what opportunities start in terms of, what opportunities exist in terms of looking at, and I'm going to talk particularly on S2, the climate space, opportunities that exist to facilitate green businesses in the economy, green jobs, etc. So you start looking at that positive outlook. And I think the conversation today is anchored very correctly so on one, how do you continuously facilitate and ensure that South Africa's ease of doing business, attractiveness for investors is enhanced. So I think those three are quite important. The different role players, I think, is a very key consideration. The role of regulators, the role of ourselves as big business, one as the drivers of implementation, what levers exists, how could you, even if you are looking at mandatory or voluntary, ensure that you are starting to call it facilitate the competitiveness within the space, I think will be good. So a couple of considerations there, but I think if I were to bucket it in short, that benefits component, appreciating the cost of not doing it, and then also the different role players in making sure that there's successful adoption. And our adoption, I think 100% for early adoption, it can be gradual, but perhaps staggering what that gradual means and looks like will be important. Thank you.
I would just like to add, so I'm excited that our regulators are at this point where they are considering. Maybe just a request, we know from experience that if you're a pioneer, it's difficult to start out because the challenges are, lack of data, lack of methodology, lack of know-how. But as you progress and as you grow and learn, it becomes more feasible. I think for companies starting out now, the PCAF methodology is already there, and the technology is there. We've learned a lot. There's a lot more data available, so the challenges aren't as huge as they were. But it's taken us a long time. So my plea to the regulators is make it mandatory, but please provide us with a honeymoon period. Because even, especially companies just starting out, just don't forget that the report is the end result. It's like ticking the box at the end of the journey. There's an immense amount of work that needs to go into the company, into strategy, into governance, into risk management, and into setting targets and objectives before you even get to the point where you can make a disclosure that is really meaningful. And it takes a lot of time. It's not something that can be rushed. So I really ask on behalf of smaller companies and ourselves that we work together. It's not an us and them kind of situation, but that we try and get this done over a period of time and not to delay it too long, but that we eventually put out reports that actually has real value.
Okay, I think both my colleagues have pretty much covered it, but I think it's just, like you said, just structured guidance in terms of, what would be expected, from a small, medium, or a large organization in terms of what you would need to report on. And I think also in terms of the metrics, to my colleague on the left, in terms of from a social perspective here in South Africa, we're very much different to some of the other countries itself in terms of what our challenges are and what we should be looking at monitoring and measuring in terms of impact as well, specifically from a social perspective, because inequality in our country is very much different if you look at some of the other countries itself where the standard would be applied. So I think for me that would be my input in terms of what we should be looking at. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the panel. The message is very clear to the drafters and the policy makers. If you make it mandatory, create a space for businesses to be able to adapt, then also awareness, because obviously for the small business, it's actually a new area that they need to learn. Some of the big businesses are doing it already, but then they still need to actually prepare. So the key thing is that do create that awareness, consult. So as you draft, do talk to them so that then it doesn't become a strange document that they have to implement. And then I guess the key thing now is that where do you start? Do you start with the big or do you start with the small enterprises? But it looks like you will have to start, but gradually taking everybody along. Thank you so much to my panelists. If we can give them a round of applause. Thank you.